absolutely essential. Almost, if you look around the world, there's been almost no successful economy that has not had some form of industrial policy. Sometimes it's hidden, for instance, in the Defense Department, as in the United States, but the internet, which is the most important innovation probably in the world, was supported by the U.S. was basically an innovation of the U.S. government. So you have to understand that every country has an industrial policy. Sometimes they shape the economy without thinking about it. You pass laws, you liberalize, you regulate. In the United States, again, that our industrial policy led to an overloaded financial sector. 40% of all profits went into the financial sector. It was clearly a distortion and brought our economy down. So for Africa, where the problem is job creation, inequality, it's clear that markets have not provided the solution, not a surprise. And therefore, there needs to be a more active role for government. Markets are still at the core, but there needs to be a more active role for government to push, move, ensure that the markets perform the roles that they can perform.
You've argued that structural adjustment has effectively led to the deindustrialization of Africa. Given that that was part of the kind of, mantra that was preached to African governments for much of the 1980s and 1990s, leading to declines in your manufacturing sector and so on, or what little was left, how do we catch up, and how does developing coherent industrial policy continent-wide allow us to catch up? Is that even possible with, manufacturing giants like China and India and Brazil?
Oh, I think there's a real opportunity. In fact, one of the main thrusts of the discussion we had here in South Africa was that this was a moment of opportunity. Wages, real wages, cost of production are going up significantly in China. We looked at a case study, for instance, in Ethiopia, where if you looked at the cost of production, much lower, taking, wages relative to productivity, much lower than in Vietnam and China. There are bottlenecks. There are problems of infrastructure, again, a responsibility of the government. There are problems of access to finance. Often financial markets are more interested in lending to consumers for housing, for buying a car, than they are for creating jobs. And this is something that has to be addressed in a development agenda.
We've talked about infrastructure. You've just mentioned that that is a big component of what government brings to the table, particularly around industrial policy. But if you look at the African context, in some cases we have very dysfunctional states. We have states with very little capacity. How useful is industrial policy, in that context? And what do you need to do to beef up that capacity, across the continent?
Well, that was another question that was explicitly discussed. We had people from Korea, people from Mauritius. In many cases, the state capacity at the beginning of the transition of the development strategy was comparable to that, or even below that, of many African states. Per capita income, the state of government capacity in Korea was not very good in the beginning of its enormously successful growth strategy. So where capacity is important is really how you design your policy, what policies are appropriate. So for instance, infrastructure is part of an industrial policy. Every government has to build roads. If you don't, you have no hope. You have to build ports. So that's an example of thinking, as you build ports, as you build roads, what is the direction of your economy? You have to regulate the financial sector. Every government does. Anyone that has tried to survive without it, it's been a disaster. So you're going to have to address the problem of how do you make the financial markets serve the rest of the economy. So you have to adapt to the capacities, but you're going to have to perform these functions in any economy.
Professor, talk to us about what are the lessons that we can learn from the Asian experiences, and can they necessarily be replicated? You spoke earlier about, capacity levels being at comparable levels, but I mean, a lot of Asian societies are quite closed societies, for example. So there's not a lot of negotiation around what it is that you make laws about. In a country like South Africa, we have a very active populace where people want to be consulted and spoken to and so on. We've seen with the e-tolls, for example, there's often a backlash, and it's not that easy. Development doesn't happen in that straight line. How do you take what was working in Asia, adapt them to an African context, given that societies are often so very different from each other?
Well, first I want to point out that when I said that the capacities were comparable to Asia, I wasn't referring to South Africa, whose capacities are much greater than the capacities were in Korea, say 40, 45 years ago. So South Africa is beginning with a big advantage. Now, one important thing is they have transparency, because citizens need to know what exactly the government is doing. You know, why is it doing what it's doing? I think that actually industrial policies, when there is broader citizen participation, can be even more effective, because what you're trying to do is enlist the strength of the entire society in moving in a particular direction. Make people realize that, look at an imperative for South Africa is job creation, creating more equality, and then have a nationwide discussion. What does that mean? You know, markets aren't doing it now. We're not getting it under the current framework. What are some of the possibilities for more effective job creation? What are the trade-offs? We have limited resources. How do we go about dealing with it? One of the important and controversial areas is macroeconomic policy, monetary policy. No economy can industrialize with an overvalued exchange rate. And countries that are resource rich, like South Africa, tend to have overvalued currencies. And there's a wealth of experience on how governments have succeeded in bringing down the exchange rate.